Hello and welcome to Policy Watch, the show that gets you all the important economic developments of the week. Before we get to our top story, here are the headlines of the week. The government cruises to a win on the FDI vote in the Lok Sabha. The BSP announces it will support the government in the Rajya Sabha as well. Indian exports to China on the wane. Trade deficit between the two countries widens in the ongoing quarter. Steep moderation in growth expected, says the RBI governor. Will take that into account at the next policy review meet, says Subbarao. Those are the headlines, and my guest this week is Soumyakanti Ghosh, Director Economic Research Cell at FICCI. Welcome to the show. Let's start with our top story right away. The government on Wednesday won the parliament vote in favour of FDI in retail in the Lok Sabha. The BJP motion against FDI in multi-brand retail was defeated as the UPA won 253 votes in the favour as opposed to 218 votes against FDI. Here's a report. Take a look.
The vote on the issue of allowing 51% foreign direct investment in multi-brand retail was finally won by the government after voting took place in the lower house of the parliament on Wednesday. Attacking the opposition's demand to roll back FDI in multi-brand retail, UPA 2 politicians argued in favour of the provision. Commerce Minister Anand Sharma said that FDI will ensure adequate storage facilities and reduce wastage. He added this will help farmers who suffer due to lack of food management infrastructure.
It is not an overnight decision. We have consulted all states, political parties and farmers' unions. Every proposal will be scrutinized by FIPB under the framework. Minimum investment of $100 million will be allowed, out of which 50% will go in rural areas, and the 30% of all sourcing must be done from small business.
Leader of opposition in Lok Sabha Sushma Swaraj questioned the claimed consensus on FDI. She mentioned that if the Samajwadi Party had voted against it, FDI and multi-brand retail would not have been a reality.
Had the two parties voted according to their stand in the parliament, then the government would have been defeated and the issue of the FDI dropped. It would have saved the livelihoods of millions of small businessmen. But the Samajwadi Party and Bahujan Samaj Party has this sin to their credit now. By not voting with the opposition, SP and BSP have virtually supported FDI.
The government had come under fire from many political parties after it approved 51% FDI in multi-brand retail in September. Following the decision, Mamata Banerjee-led Trinamool Congress had withdrawn its support from the UPA 2 alliance. The industry, on the other hand, welcomed the approval accorded by Lok Sabha to FDI and multi-brand retail, saying it will send a strong signal to foreign investors and enable the government to take up further economic reforms. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
And the BSP did support the government in the Rajya Sabha. Just 2 days later, on Friday, the government won a second vote in the upper house. The vote in the Rajya Sabha was symbolic but still significant as the UPA government is in a minority in the upper house. The government's managers came through and the motion to disapprove the FDI decision was defeated, with Mayawati's BSP supporting the government and Mulayam Singh and the SP walking out. The government is claiming the vote as a victory for the common man, while the opposition, though humbled in both houses, is still putting up a brave face and a brave front, describing their defeat as a moral victory. Soumya, the vote is over. The government won in both houses. The vote would not even have been binding even if the government had lost. It's an executive decision. But it's understood that if the government had lost in both houses, the Manmohan Singh government would have been under pressure perhaps to roll back the measure. Now the path is clear for global giants like Walmart and Carrefour and even Tesco to come into India. It's a $450 billion industry. Indian industry must be relieved.
Yeah, I think it's a very positive step. So, first of all, let me just make a point clear that FDI in multi-brand is not going to be a magic wand that is going to solve India's problem. But if you look at the last 3 months, from September to November, when the government started announcing these reforms, there has been a perceptible improvement in the investor confidence, and that is exactly what this FDI and multi-brand retail is going to do. For example, the portfolio inflows, which was languishing, and it was actually an outflow in the earlier months. In the last 3 months, from September to November, the portfolio inflows has been a huge 8.6 US billion. And the stock market also has jumped the 19,000 mark, even though the stock market may not matter too much to a common man, but it will matter a lot to a government disinvestment program where the government is under pressure to meet the 5.31% fiscal deficit. And finally, if you also look at some of the data which has been coming in, for example, the number of projects which were stalled earlier, people were taking a wait and watch decision for the industry, that is also on the decline. So on and on, it is going to give a pep up to the investor confidence, and that is precisely what we have been looking at.
So you're saying more than anything else, the industry will look at it as an indication that the government is serious about economic reform, and that in turn will help put the faith back in investors across the board. Isn't that what you're saying?
Yeah. See, another, I mean, absolutely. For example, I mean, for the last couple of months, there has been a lot of discussion that the government has not been taking policy decisions. It has been a little, little lazy, I will not say, a little late in taking policy decision. But the amount of decision which is coming in the last 2 to 3 months, that is absolutely remarkable. And I believe that this is going to help the industry and also the economy over a point of time. That's why I said at the beginning, without getting into the discussion of the pros and cons of an FDI multi-brand retail, the single biggest thing which is going to do and has already done, if you look in the last couple of weeks or couple of days, is that and significant improvement in investor confidence. The rupee, which was languishing around 56, 57, has now pulled back to 53, 54. And please remember that every 1% appreciation in the rupee value has a significant impact on our oil import bill. Absolutely. And also on that imported inflation, which is the RBI has been often quoting that because of that it cannot cut the rates.
Absolutely. I want to ask you one point. We discussed this before the show as well. And I don't want you to go into the politics of it. But the question is this. Now that the opposition has lost, the BJP and the other opposition parties, their move to disapprove FDI has been thwarted. There are fears that because the government is going to get the insurance bill and the government has set the cap of 49%, the opposition wants it to be at 26%. You told me earlier that that doesn't really matter, but do you think that the investors will take heart from the fact that the government has become a good vote manager in parliament and there is no really real cause for worry?
Yes, of course. I think this single most decision, I think all of us were the last, if you look, the winter session started in the last week of November. The government has been trying to manage the vote bank and ultimately it had owned in both the houses, the upper house and the lower house. So I think that is a very positive signal which has gone through the market. If suppose the government has lost, it didn't have mattered because an executive decision and so the decision had already been taken. But I think in the end, it is going to send out a strong message to the foreign investors. And given the India's fiscal position is not that good at the point of time, I think this message will be reassuring to the foreign investors and that could have a perceptible impact on the fiscal deficit, and the government could now actually take some of the decisions on the fiscal side which it has been trying to do for a long time but may not have been able to do.
If the problem or if the question really is not what cap there is in the insurance sector, what is the real question in the insurance sector?
See, the real issue, I mean, insurance sector, obviously a cap in these amount will put in some money, but if you look at the insurance sector numbers in the last 2 years, from the September 2010, there is a lot of changes in the industry in terms of the regulator has introduced stricter norms from the industry. And one of the reasons and most of the players conceive that the cost of each of the product has gone up significantly. Most of these insurance players have closed down offices in some of the areas, and the other important thing which has happened to them is that not only closing down offices, some of the products like the pension products, they are not offering any product at this point of time because of the assured return which the regulator often talks through. All these measures which have been taken are in the interest of the consumer, but I think it will take a significant amount of time or maybe amount of time for the industry to come to terms with them, because if you start looking at 2001 when the industry was opened up, the share of a traditional product with the new leaf product, which is based on only the common link, was around 90 to 10. For example, traditional was around 10% and new leaf was around 90%. Now after 2010, the industry, the share has actually declined to around 70 to 30 or even 60 to 40 for some of the players. So at ratio of 9 to 10 at 2010, and if the ratio changes from 70 to 30 in a 2-year point of time, that is going to have a significant impact of the industry, given that the traditional products which obviously are the products which an insurance, if I am an insurer, if I am going to insure myself, I am going to lap up an insurance product, but traditional products takes a little bit of time, and the most of these players are now already making a profit. But I think this product diversification, which was earlier, and completely getting into a different sort of product diversification, the industry will take some time to adjust.
Let's talk about the markets now. The vote must have cheered up the markets. It did cross the 19,000 mark, like you just said. Do you think that the industry as well as the markets will take hope from the fact that the government has done what it promised to do, and they will feel a sense of security about the government's seriousness and its political will for reforms?
Absolutely. If you look at the markets, as I said to in the beginning, stock market touching 19,000, 20,000 may not mean too much to a common man. Right. But please do note that the stock market touching 19,000, 20,000 will mean a lot to the government, because it has to, the disinvestment program and the fiscal deficit target this year is looking very difficult. The government has already admitted and is going to overshoot the deficit, and it is trying its best to contain the deficit at 5.3%.
Which also looks very tough.
Which also looks very tough. So I think, given the market behaving at this point of time, that would actually have come at a blessing in disguise to the government, and that is going to help the disinvestment program to a significant extent. We already have seen that the spectrum collections which the government has done was not successful, and I think this is going to be a departure from the past, and there lies the difference.
One last question on this, but it's connected to this one. Does this now, Soumya, pave the way for other crucial bills that the government was supposed to introduce or is around introducing? The banking bill, for example, that the government has also been putting a lot of pressure on the RBI for new banking licenses. Where do you think that particular thing?
I think that is a very crucial bill. The banking sector regulation bill should be passed in the parliament, hopefully this session, because I think that is one of the demands that the RBI has consistently placed, that it should be given more powers for the boards, superseding the boards. And I think once this bill has been passed, then the RBI actually can start thinking of rolling out the license to the new private sector banks, which could be a reality. So we could actually see a plethora of new private sector banks in 2013 a reality.
We'll have to wait and watch what the RBI takes a decision on that or not. We'll take a small break, Soumya. We'll come back with the second story of the week. Don't go anywhere. Keep watching Policy Watch. Welcome back. Now, India's exports to China have declined by 19.65% during the first 6 months of the current fiscal, leaving trade deficit of over $21 billion. India's exports to China totaled 6,408.11 million during the first half of the 2012-13 fiscal. India's imports from China for the April-September 2012-13 reached 28,028.24 million, recording a decline of 2.45% as compared to the same period of the previous fiscal. The trade deficit between India and China stood at about 21.6 billion in the April-September period. For the current fiscal, the decline in bilateral trade is being attributed to overall negative global sentiment because of economic recession and low demand from the US as well as Europe. So, why the sudden dip in exports, particularly to China? Any particular reason that you see for it?
See, I'll tell you, the exports, the Indian exports have been not doing well in the this year. For the first 6 months, the point which you mentioned in the first is the overall global trend. Indian exports have actually declined in the first 6 months. So I think this is in line with what the Indian exports have been doing. But the point which is important over here, that the growth, the fall in exports to China has been significantly higher than the fall in exports to the rest of the world. See, one of the reasons behind it, I think, is structural nature. This has been pointed out earlier, several times discussed and debated. The most important thing is that if you look at Indian export basket, one of the significant items of Indian exports are gems and jewellery, machineries, garments. But if you look at the exports of India to China, remarkably, the exports to China which India has, for example, like iron ore and other items, they are not even appear in the top 20 list of commodities which India exports to worldwide. Right. So the point which I am trying to make is that Indian exports to China are always skewed against India's comparative advantage where it can export. And the other point which over here is I want to mention is the imports which India do from China also. That has been a problem earlier, and China has also facing the same problem this year because of the worldwide recession. And China, but it has actually cleverly tried to diversify its export basket, and India is one of them. And the important point about China is that China's manufacturing is also not doing significantly better in the last couple of years because of the global recession. So China actually has been trying to diversify, and India is one of the markets. That's why we'll find that the Indian imports to China from China has always been significantly higher than the exports to China.
When the minister was asked why the exports are dipping right now, his answer was the decline in exports can be attributed to the decrease in shipments of iron ore, other ores and minerals, plastics, electronic goods, drugs, transport equipment, etc. Now, in some cases like the UAE and Kuwait, they've also banned exports from India because of bird flu or other reasons that they've given. Also, there's a ban on iron ore exports from Karnataka and Goa, two big states that export iron ore. As a result, the trade deficit has swelled. Do you think that's, because you already mentioned that the ratio was always skewed, but is the trade deficit with China swelling alarming at this stage, or should we not worry about it?
I think the numbers which we talking about the last 6 months is actually a cause for worry, because more Chinese imports is always, I mean, not good for the Indian industry, because Indian industry has always been complaining about the tax structure which is higher as opposed to the Chinese players who has a very good tax advantage. So I think it's a cause for worry. But the point, again, the point which I'm trying to mention, and what the point which Minister says is actually there's something more than it reveals. And because India exports more of iron ore to China, which is not even appearing in the top 20.
Right.
So India needs to get into some sort of exporting those commodities where India has a comparative advantage.
So India needs to diversify its exports.
Yes.
So one last question on this particular story. What, according to you, can the government really do? What measures can it take to actually give a boost to exports, which seem to be on the wane for the past 6 months?
See, I mean, overall exports or exports, see, if you compare...
Starting with China.
Yeah, see, if you compare starting with China, there are some restrictions with China. For example, India cannot export meat. That is the point which you mentioned. Fruits and vegetables is another of the item. And this has also been some of the case with India's neighbors. So this Indian government needs to speak to the Chinese counterpart to see why India cannot export this type of products to China, because China also has a huge market for this meat, because China is one of the largest pork consuming country in the world. So that is one thing with the Indian government, and the Indian government should also closely look at some of the structures, the duty structures, which sometimes are more loaded against the domestic players as opposed to a Chinese player.
Right.
So this is some of the things which the government of India can do, but I believe that the exports, the downside in exports, Indian exports have done remarkably well in the last couple of years, but this year it was expected not to do well, and it is actually been reflected in that fact. And
it's also part of a global trend, as we are seeing.
Yeah.
Right. On that note, we'll take another short break. We'll come back with a third story. You might find that interesting. Subbarao has mentioned and hinted at perhaps monetary easing in the next month. We'll discuss that after the break. More with Soumyakanti Ghosh on the other side of this break. Welcome back to Policy Watch. Now, RBI Governor D. Subbarao has said that there was a steep moderation in growth, which the Apex Bank would take into account in its mid-quarter and quarterly policies. Interestingly, the RBI Governor also said that the government's policy to provide direct cash transfers would have no impact on inflation. When asked about financing the current account deficit, or CAD, Subbarao said that he doesn't see that as a potential problem, adding that the RBI is doing an internal assessment of the CAD and that can't be made public at this particular juncture. The statement comes a month after Subbarao had indicated that the central bank could ease the monetary policy in the next quarterly review meeting of the central bank in January. So, a steep moderation in growth, Subbarao made that statement. How expectant are you, and how expectant is industry of an easing of monetary policy in the January meeting?
See, I think industry is always, considers a rate cut to be a stimulus for investment. Leaving that aside,
but realistically, do you see?
Realistically, I think there is now a significant scope for a rate reduction, because the way the growth rate has been, the growth has dipped to 5.3% in the last quarter. And I think the inflation numbers which you look into the last time which came in October, it was around 7.5%. So that was a significant decline from 8%. And the important point is that some of the items which the Reserve Bank of India monitors very closely, for example, the core manufacturing inflation, that has declined to 5.2%, 5% RBI considers to be an acceptable one. So I think the numbers now look perfect for a rate cut, and hopefully the RBI will mobilize.
The RBI and the finance minister and the finance ministry have been sort of exchanging words over the past 2-3 months. But do you think even if growth has moderated or does moderate, there is still no substantial decline in overall inflation? If there is no substantial decline by January, do you still think the RBI can perhaps maybe delay the postpone an interest rate cut, if that happens?
See, I'll just, let me just go back and give an example. I think 2-3 days, the governor also made a statement that the acceptable rate of inflation, which is 5%, the RBI needs to look at the acceptable rate of inflation instead of the global changing circumstances. So he may have been hinting at a new normal inflation acceptable rate, which could be higher than the 5%. So from that point of view, if you look at the number 7.5, and for the last 2 years consistently the RBI has increased the rates, and if you look at the inflation numbers, I mean it has been predominantly driven by the food prices, and the contribution, there has been some jump in the manufacturing component, but I believe that a significant jump has been given by the food prices. Given the food prices now are currently on the wane, it could be an ideal recipe for the RBI to go for a rate reduction. And the other important point which we are saying at this point of time is the numbers have not declined significantly. I think one of the numbers which you may have in your mind is the retail numbers, which is largely close to 10%. But let me reassure you over here that the retail numbers is not going to decline significantly over even the next 6 months or so, because food has a significantly higher weightage in the retail. So it is not, I mean, it is very difficult for me to believe that the retail numbers will also decline to 7%, and then the RBI will cut the rates. And there is another debate which I want to highlight over here. RBI has a discussion paper whereby it talks about a growth inflation trade-off. So from that point of view, and the ratio which is gives set is 2. So going by that ratio, what does that mean in this Indian context is that if currently the rate of inflation is 7.5%, if we are to reduce that rate to 5%, that means a 2.5% reduction, the growth rate has to fall by 5%. That means from 5.3%, the growth rate will actually decline to less than 0.5%. This is as per RBI's own data. So my only point over here is that if we wait too long, the growth rate may decline significantly. And given that the government has also doing its bit, which what the RBI has repeatedly saying that is not only a part of the monetary policy, is also fiscal consolidation. The government has been trying to fiscal consolidation. It is too early to say. October numbers for fiscal consolidation, look at them, they have been a little better. So there is a strong case. So there is a strong case that you actually go ahead for a rate cut and give a pep up to the investor confidence, which is on the little bit on the upside.
Some people would say that they've waited long enough and this is the time for a rate cut. On that note, Soumya, we'll end our show today. Many thanks for joining us on Policy Watch. That was Soumyakanti Ghosh, who is the Director of the Economic Research Cell at FICCI. Many thanks for joining us as well. Our first story, our top story this week on Policy Watch was the government cruising in both houses of parliament on the FDI vote. Like we said before, even if they had lost, it wouldn't have been binding. It's an executive decision. But more than anything else, what it does is, and as my guests agree, is that it'll give a pep up to investors, put the faith back in investors, and make them believe that the government is really serious about economic reforms and has the political will to actually carry forward the reform and go through with it. Good news for the industry there. Second story on Policy Watch this week was the Indian exports to China on the wane. Trade deficit between the two countries has been swelling, but like my guest said, the ratio has always been skewed. What we need to do, what India needs to do, is perhaps diversify the trade basket, the export basket, and export other substances that we do not really export. Like my guest today mentioned, iron ore is not even in the top 20 of that basket. India needs to diversify its export basket. Our third story this week, and pretty much perhaps the most important story that will be in the coming weeks and as we step into the new year, is the RBI's January meeting, policy review meeting. So Varao has said that even if steep moderation, there is a steep moderation in growth, my guests believe, and I'm pretty sure the industry believes as well, that this is high time for an interest rate cut. Like my guest also said, over the next 6 months or so, inflation, the smaller numbers perhaps will not be as better as we want, but this is the high time for a rate cut. We have to wait and watch whether or not Governor Subbarao and his team take that decision in the January meeting. That's all the time we have on Policy Watch today. This week, till next time, Athar Khan saying goodbye, good night, and thank you for watching.